What's interesting is the worst technology always won. Yeah, I mean, that was just harsh reality at that point because it was first into the market. And each was a co-evolutionary pattern. There was a point, and if you watched the market quickly, you could see the point where it had gone over the tipping point, to use a legitimate concept from Gladwell, and basically it wasn't going to go back. Which is why weak signal detection is key when you're doing user requirements or project rollout, because once a view is formed about the system, going backwards is impossible. You need to capture stuff early on in terms of the way things work. So from that we get Cynefin, and Cynefin has 4 domains. Order divides into simple and complicated. In simple order, the relationship between cause and effect is self-evident to any reasonable person. Therefore, I can sense, categorize, respond. In software design terms, that's where you use waterfall. There ain't anything wrong with waterfall if you're dealing with simple requirements. Yeah, a mistake many people make is now everything has to be complex. It doesn't. Yeah, human beings, actually, a lot of things are simple. Yeah, I don't want to use an agile approach to develop bank payment systems. I want to use a waterfall, highly structured approach because I know exactly what's needed, everybody agrees what's needed, therefore I can impose rigid order. In a complicated system, there is a relationship between cause and effect. It does repeat, but I can't know it unless I do some sort of analysis or I bring in experts. And that's where conventional prototyping works well. I'd actually argue, if I'm being brutal about this, that most Scrum Agile training doesn't get out of the complicated, but it uses complex language. Yeah, because it basically focuses on fast prototyping or variations on the theme. Now the reality is that's a way of finding out a relationship which will repeat. So I sense, analyze, respond, I apply good practice. In a complex system, it's very different. Here, and I'm going to make what is probably the most controversial but the most important point of today, a complex system is not causal, it's dispositional. It's why we talk in complexity of modulators, not drivers. Because you can't say in a complex system, if I do X, it will produce Y result. The same thing only happens again the same way twice by accident. Which means each context is a new emergent context in which a different solution will find its way. Now we can measure dispositionality of systems, but we have to stop thinking in terms of causal models. That's where we get into these co-evolutionary approaches to software design, where you don't actually fix the requirement, you constantly interact the two. And then finally, chaos. That's where completely novel patterns exist. But the reality is, and I want to really emphasize this, most people, I've seen a lot of Cynefin frameworks in blogs, and most people have this desperately desire to use all 4 categories, and that's my fault from the way I originally wrote it. Chaos is not a category, it's a transitionary state. You can fall into it, and that's a crisis, or you can deliberately enter it in order to actually produce novelty. But it's always a dynamic, it's never a static. Yeah, nearly everything I've seen in the blogs, basically they're using complexity they're using chaos for what is actually complex. The minute there are any constraints, it's complex. Yeah, so think about chaos as transitioning. Now, one of the ways of thinking about this is to think about roundabouts. Has anybody driven around this? Okay, this is 12 miles. You can buy a t-shirt now. I've survived the magic roundabout, all right? This is 12 miles north of where I live. It's a roundabout of roundabouts. That's what it looks like from on top.
Who designed this?
Nobody did. What they actually did is they cleared the space and they moved barriers around for 2 years with traffic monitors until they had a pattern which optimized traffic flow. That has the lowest accident rate per movement of any junction in Europe. It never, ever jams up. Despite the fact there's a football ground, Intel's European headquarters, a regional hospital, 2 shopping malls, and a motorway accident, all of which feed into it. Because actually it's a complex adaptive system. It's got boundaries. Yeah, you have to drive on the left because we're a civilized country. You can't take your 4x4 across the lines, you've got to follow the pattern. But those of us who are local just drive into it and just go in roughly the right direction. And we pop out at the right end. If you think about it too much, you freeze. I've done controlled experiments on that with American vice presidents in IBM. they freeze and hand over control of the car to you, which gives you alpha male dominance for the rest of the week but damages your career. Right? Because they just can't cope. Now, Australians cope with it because they know about roundabouts, but they don't know about big roundabouts like this. Yeah? What happens, and this is a key concept, is we distribute cognition to the drivers. We maintain control of the system overall. Again, a lot of people make this mistake. They think complexity is about distributing decision making. It isn't. You centralize decision making, you distribute cognition. You only distribute decision making in boundaries because you have to see the system as a whole. You don't just allow anybody to go away and do whatever they want, they do it within constraints. So basically every driver makes a decision about which way to go, and all they have is a boundary condition which imposes constraints, so the system adapts. If you look at the pictures, this is on a permanent webcam, because it's the only thing which has any interest whatsoever in Swindon. Sorry, I live on the other side of the hill from Swindon. We try and pretend it doesn't exist, all right? We're just grateful the railway went through that, not Marlborough. Yeah? But fundamentally, if you look at the webcams on this, you'll see the pattern changes throughout the day. Because by distributing cognition within a boundaried space, the drivers actually can reprocess and readapt very quickly. Centralized cognition, on the other hand, is that. Now, before you get nervous, there is actually a sculpture in Tower Hamlets, but I've seen roundabouts, junctions up the Hudson Valley which look just like this. These are engineers deciding they know what's best. Yeah, actually, we can work it out. We'll design a system. We'll tell people when they can come and go. It will work. And of course, what you actually is wave motion, queuing theory, all those sort of things come in. Yeah? So that's one of the key principles of complexity, which is called distributed cognition. You have to distribute the cognitive process into the network itself because you need more scanning density. Second one, finely grained objects. I talked about this on acceptation. If you have small objects at the right level of modularity, they can combine and recombine in different ways. If you chunk things up too much, they can't. Right? So the modularity is actually key on this. Fragment them too much, it gets chaotic. Yeah? And Brian Arthur's book on this is really interesting. He talks about the level of modularity you need for acceptation to take place. And the final one is called disintermediation, which is you have to remove interpretive layers between the raw data and the person doing the work. So actually you want direct access to user stories. You don't want it summarized in a document by a systems analyst. Because the act of summarization actually destroys value. It gets rid of things which don't fit the pattern of the analyst thinking. Yeah, so disintermediation is a key concept. And of course culture is the most complex thing of all. And that's where we move into this key concept of narrative. Anthropologists, that's a storyteller doll from New Mexico, by the way. Anthropologists now talk about we're the storytelling ape. Homo narrans, not Homo sapiens. Stories are fundamental to human sense-making. And I don't mean the stories that people tell you in a workshop. That's another of the confusion. People have seized on this, and now they're running facilitated workshops to get people to tell stories, which is a variation on use cases with a more modern word. What you actually want is the micro fragments. The stories of the water cooler, of the shopping queue, of the frustration when something doesn't work on a system. You want the fragmented micro-narratives of day-to-day existence, because those determine what we are. And they're very different from the structured stories you get in a formalized process. Those micro-narratives determine the pattern of use. We're now doing work in user requirements capture, which I'm going to go public on in a couple of weeks' time, in which we're actually, instead of actually going out and saying, what do you want of the new system? Anybody done that at some time? Or run a RAD-JAD session or whatever. We actually give people an app or a paper, and for 3 months, they just, every time they're frustrated or they see something they find useful, or they think of an opportunity, they tell a story. They write a brief note, or they take a picture, or they capture the screen, and they self-index in an interpretive framework their own story. That's key because it gives us statistical data. Then we look for clumping patterns in the indexing, and if the patterns start to clump together, then we build an object within an architecture which matches that need. Now this is a radical switch. Yeah? What it means is you move into continuous micro-narrative capture of, if necessary, the whole user population. As patterns start to emerge from those narratives, you put software into those spaces because they're emergent possibilities. That means you build an architecture with objects rather than an application, the other key switch. And so you're constantly building things in against unarticulated requirements and allowing them to co-evolve. The cost of doing this is significantly less than traditional design. And to my mind, it's where Agile always wanted to go. Because then your capture system becomes your feedback system, becomes your project management system, becomes your reporting system, because now you can measure the impact of technology, through the stories that people are telling before and after you put in the small disposable objects. And this moves software into a safe-to-fail development environment. You build a robust architecture, and those you can buy these days, then you build small objects which match against user requirements, and you just keep building them, keep modifying them, but within that constraint-based framework. Narrative is fundamental. And I won't go through that because that's kind of like it's a pattern. Disintermediation. I've used this a lot. This is actually a counter-terrorist example, but we're using the same technology on requirements capture now. That's called an attractor landscape. It has 17,000 micro-narratives in it. The hollows represent stable patterns in those narratives. The peaks represent fluctuations, and the saddles between the peaks represent new opportunities. Start to see how this works? As a designer, I can now look at that, I can click on the model, I can read the stories, I can design something for those stories. But I only design it when I get a hollow, because that means I've got a stable requirement. I actually design software to meet needs that people currently have, rather than trying to create the need through training courses and everything else downstream. The other thing about this is you'll notice there are yellow dots on that model. On this one, what we actually did is to freeze the model, and what we're looking for is outlier events. So when you move from software design is what are the hollows? Monitoring for impact. You're not interested in the hollows anymore, you're interested in the outliers. You see that final slide? You see this cluster of 8 stories in the bottom right? That's a negative pattern. That's 8 stories out of 28,000. That means you now go to the users and you fix the problem. Because you've actually caught it before it becomes big and people start to talk about it formally. We're doing the same work on anomaly detection in the aircraft industry. Engineers capture anomalies and index anomalies whenever they see them. Currently, they only report anomalies when they're big enough to be taken seriously. Now, if an engineer hasn't caught 20 anomalies a day, they're punished. Those are anonymized, and then we look for cluster patterns in the anomalies, which gives us early indications of things like metal fatigue. And again, this is the same thing in the user population. As you start to roll out software, you want very fast feedback, which actually tells you how things are working or not working, and what you've got here is statistics backed up by narrative. And again, you should now start to see where I'm going on design theory. In this case, you're creating a totally exaptive, co-evolutionary interaction between users and also technologists. And the design is a result of the interaction, not some creative coming in and telling you what to do. Because you're moving in the system. That's disintermediation, direct access with the data. That allows us to kind of like conclude on this, to look at 3 differences. I'm going to talk here about pre-designed design. Now, different people will say different things, but I've taken the pre-designed design differences from a couple of textbooks, and then complexity. On the first one, design argues we produce solutions that work quickly rather than a sort of deeply analytical, and I would say Newtonian science approach or hypothesis-based approach. Complexity moves on from that and talks about co-evolution. So instead of actually saying the designer designs, we co-evolve needs and requirements and technologies. Incidentally, that's one of the ways that you can produce validation for introducing a technology that users don't know what they want yet. We did a project for Philips not so long ago in which we captured stories from people about their gardens. We then got people to index all of Philips' lighting technologies and these existing silos who don't talk with each other using the same index set. Then we mashed the databases together and came up with 5 clusters where technologies actually interacted with stories. And we ended up taking technologies, for example, from football stadium design and actually using them in gardens themselves, exaptation. See the point? Bringing things together at a fragmented level and actually seeing the patterns in it. And often, I've done a lot of this in my life, you know the user would use something, but you can't persuade them because they've never seen it. With these type of design approaches, you can throw examples in and see what people pick up. Yeah, and if the ones that work, you amplify; the ones that don't work, you dampen. Secondly, analytic thinking is contrasted with synthesis. In complexity thinking, we talk about managed acceptation. Yeah, we're not concerned with analytical thinking or synthesis thinking. We're concerned about creating the conditions under which people will notice chocolate bars melting when they're next to a radar and realize the potential. Yeah, so you're putting things together at a micro level so that new patterns emerge. And again, I want to emphasize, it doesn't challenge the value of design thinking, it bounds it. Design thinking is intimately linked with systems thinking, it's part of that period, it has huge value, but it fundamentally deals with complicated systems where you've got a known requirement, rather than complex systems where you've got no idea what to do. We talk about experts to creatives. I mean, in the old days, it was experts decided what you wanted. Now the idea is creatives produce brilliant designs. Now we're talking about distributed cognition. Direct engagement with fragmented observations from users with technologies. So that actually we've got a distributed cognitive function. We're not then dependent on gifted individuals. This is the other big difference with systems thinking. Systems thinking tries to define an ideal person. Anybody been on a leadership training course? Anybody read books on leadership? Anybody seen the contradictions between the books? You know, or mayors of New York who write books about leadership and then can't even get on the Republican shortlist, right, the next time round. The reality is there isn't a defined characteristic of a leader. Leadership is contextual. Yeah, and that is actually one of the key differences. What we focus on is not building systems based on ideal people, and I'd argue a lot of agile training does this. It says you've got to be this sort of person to do the design. Nobody in a military environment would ever do that. They build processes in order that incompetent people can be competent in social processes. So again, that's the pragmatism. It's build systems that don't require brilliant people to make them work. Because the reality is you won't have those on a regular basis. They're deeply pragmatic. Secondly, process control, and then actually what you then get, and this is advocated in a lot of the books, they don't like devil's advocates. Actually, they don't know their history, because devil's advocates, actually, anybody knows the history of devil's advocates? There was somebody who was meant to challenge the church before somebody could be made a saint. Yeah, and actually this is interpreted as somebody who is negative, and I've had enough of this in workshops. If you say anything negative, people pounce on you and say you're not being positive. Yeah? Which actually means they don't want to see things. The worst on these are the appreciative inquiry guys. Anybody come across appreciative inquiry? I mean, this is deeply ideological. You're not allowed to tell negative stories. You can only tell positive stories. It always reminds me of the final scene of Monty Python's Life of Brian. You know, they're all singing backwards and forwards on the cross, singing always look on the bright side of life. We have a technique called ritualized dissent, in which basically people put ideas in front of panels of people. Having put ideas, they put on masks so they can't have physical contact. And their ideas are torn apart for the next 10 minutes. Then they go back and improve them. And actually interesting is everybody enjoys that, because it's ritualized, other people are going through the same thing. In controlled tests, it increases weak signal detection by 60% over consensus-based methods. It's actually a big problem I have with open space, is it encourages consensus. It doesn't really allow dissent. And we actually have sort of post-open space methods now, which actually increase the level of dissent, but in a ritualized way, so it's not personal. And then we get on to what type of problem we have. I like the concept of wicked problems, but I prefer to call them unknown or intractable. Intractable is a better word because it actually means you can't get a grip on it. But the really key thing, what complexity approaches do, is they solve problems which have not yet been articulated. So they move from anticipation to anticipatory awareness. Now that transforms the IT department's relationship with the business, because it moves us from responding to user needs to using technology to match needs before they're articulated. And at that point, you become a strategic unit rather than a potential outsourcing unit. Very different approach in terms of the way things work. And then finally, requirements capture. feeding the creatives, all right, and then bowing down and worshipping. All right, sorry about this. I had 3 bad experiences. I know I shouldn't draw conclusions from that. And then finally, in complexity, this concept of distributed ethnography. So people become their own ethnographers. They just capture stories continuously into diary systems. You put a widget onto their browser, so every time they see something like that, they can tag it. You don't use keyword tags, by the way, because that requires a different synthesis, but that's for another day. But fundamentally, what you want is continuous capture at a micro-fragmented level. And that's kind of like a different way of defining problems, a different way of doing things. And really that's the point I've been making throughout this. This is from Seneca. Remember I said at the start? Deal with the present. The present is knowable. The future is uncertain. The more we can describe the present, and then having described the present, identifying what we can change, having identified what we can change, what changes can we monitor? Because you don't change things unless you can monitor the effect. And out of the things that you can monitor, which by success could be amplified or by failure could teach us something. So in a complex system, you produce multiple parallel safe-to-fail experiments. And actually, if half of them don't fail, you've failed. We actually now target design teams on that. If actually half of your experiments don't fail, you haven't pushed the boundaries enough. So you don't say, and this is idealism, we have a no-blame culture. Anybody heard that? Anybody ever believed it? Anybody believed it and survived their first failure? Going down. What you actually do is you create a process by which, for this thing we'll have 7 safe-to-fail experiments. 3 of them really need to fail. And actually you can design experiments which when they fail will teach you more about what's possible, but they have to be safe to fail. Very different culture. It's a culture based on ecology, not engineering. And actually we need to start to realize the role of technology is to augment human cognition, not to replace it. And that requires design to be distributed into an interaction between technologists and users and not a privileged elite. It requires distributed cognition, disintermediation, and finely grained objects. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions? I know it's 7:10. I actually kept to my time. I'm quite proud of that. Any questions? Yeah.
Yes. You were talking about famine and distress as creating creativity. How do you comment on the fact, for example, like Silicon Valley being a center of creativity today, where you don't find stuff like that?
Well, actually you do, because they get an awful lot of failures.
Yeah, but you don't have, it's not a war zone, it's not a...
No, it isn't, but people are under considerable stress. They come together, they have... I know about venture capitalists, right? I created a software company for 7 years without them, and now I'm going to them to actually scale, right? But fundamentally, I've been through it before. The pressure of the venture capitalists every month is huge. Yeah? So you're under high pressure to produce results. Right? You've also got the social pressure of the people around you in the valley who've all become millionaires. Yeah? So actually, and the days when you got a huge amount of money and nobody worried if you wasted it over 3 years are gone. Now you get small amounts of money in shorter periods of time, because actually the dot-com bubble proved that didn't work.
But how about Microsoft and Apple? There wasn't any VC pressure on that.
Have you ever met Steve Jobs? Yeah, I mean, Steve Jobs was a bloody bastard, all right? And so it's, I mean...
What was the pressure on him?
Personal drive. Not only that, he had...
So
no. But he also... No, hang on, look at the history of Steve Jobs. Next failed.
But that's post-Apple.
No, it's not. If Next hadn't... Apple initially succeeded, then failed. You're in the period where lots of people can do lots of different things. Next then fails. If Next hadn't failed, we wouldn't have OS.
True.
Okay? And actually, it's that failure which drives Jobs when he moves back into Apple to drive and build the dominance, right? And then he adopts acceptation.
But there was no threat to his existence. He was still probably a millionaire.
Have you read the autobiography?
Somewhat.
He was giving money away. He wasn't. I mean, he was under huge pressure.
Comparing statistics over population to individuals, so it's not relevant.
Well, I'm trying to deal with the question, all right? But I don't think the examples. I mean, if you look at Microsoft, they're facing IBM. If you actually look at it, what happened, and what you will now see, you can see the same thing happen to Google and Microsoft. They dominate the ecology the way that IBM dominated it. The replacements for them are under high pressure trying to find the space, but they will come in the next 4 or 5 years. Yeah, Google, because what happens is, like Google, they now employ people who think like the founders. So Google is obsessed with advertising and analytics. So they can't see human-based search mechanisms. Yeah, which is the next search paradigm.
Given the pressure Facebook, Twitter, and Google are putting on Microsoft, do you think that pressure will lead them to innovate more?
No, I think it will lead them to collapse because they're too structured. Because they're too structured. Just like IBM. The belief systems are so entrained. I remember when I joined IBM, I didn't join, they conscripted, they bought the company. There were still people who thought that people would sooner or later realize that PCs were a waste of time and go back to mainframes. Yeah, that was in the 1990s. Because once something becomes a dominant predator, this is another part of biology. Yeah, anybody read Good to Great? This is a classic example of a confusion of correlation with causation. Because if you look at the examples he chooses, they were all the examples were the first into their field. So actually, an evolutionary biologist looked at it and said it's dominant predator. The first predator into an ecology, the rest of the ecology organizes around the predator. So the predator survives no matter how incompetent they are until the ecology changes. So that's what happened to IBM. It's currently happening to Microsoft. It's currently happening to Google. Yeah, the dominant predator, everything's organized around them. They're self-reinforcing their belief. They can't abandon their financial models because they're so dependent on them. And actually, I think Facebook has got a real problem. You can see that with the share price going. Because they can't change anymore, as the ecology starts to shift around them, they'll collapse. They've got enough cash, they'll recover in a different way, like IBM did, and the new dominant predator will emerge. And that predator will have come out of a completely different environment, under high pressure, in terms of the way they work. Yeah?
Oh, never mind.
Okay. Any more?
Yes, please.
Over here, then I'll come back.
I'm sorry.
No, go on. He's asked 3 questions. You're allowed one.
No worries. No, I was thinking, as I understood, what you should strive for is to become, from an organizational point of view, a complex system. Because as looking at the definitions that you provided, the constraints would, maybe you can go back to that slide actually. There are 3 types of systems. Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, and because if you would put too much constraints or pressure, as you mentioned here previously, that would mean that you would become an ordered system, and an ordered system would kill the capability or ability to innovate.
Yes, but you need to make some things ordered. Mm-hmm. Now, this is interesting. If you actually, let's look at the Scrum books, yeah? Mm-hmm. They quote Stacy and Stacy's model. Mm-hmm. Stacy believes all human systems are complex. Mm-hmm. The big difference between Stacy and me is I believe we've learned how to make things complicated, and there ain't anything wrong with it. Mm-hmm. And what you actually find, we had this when we did Calm Alpha in the UK recently, we're doing a Canadian Agile Lean Fusion. Mm-hmm. Next one's 1st, 2nd August in Boulder, Colorado, because we're trying to integrate those methods. Mm-hmm. Yeah? What we actually found there is everybody wanted their method to be complex, because in this community, complex good, ordered bad. Mm. Now that is really stupid. Actually, ordered good, complex good. Yeah, use a complex technique in an ordered domain, it's a waste of money. Use an ordered domain in a complex domain, it's going to cost you a fortune. The issue is to understand where you are, and to actually, the company, to be able to adopt all of those methods and to apply them appropriately. So if I look at software design, waterfall, RAD-JAD, fast prototyping, self-assembling teams. Now, people get, actually, there's been an interesting illustration of, people talk about self-organizing teams. Actually, that's a misunderstanding of complexity. Yeah, complexity self-organizes because of constraints. Yeah, so when we do that, we have a simple rule. You've got to have, you can self-form a team, but the team must have one person who's a Java specialist, one systems architect with 10 years experience, one user from this department, 2 users from that department. You create rules. And you say, if you self-assemble a team within those constraints, and you produce a prototype that people want, your reward is to make that prototype a real part of the system. Your punishment is to be sent back onto the waterfall teams. Yeah, so and that is a punishment in these environments, all right, in terms of how it works. But the point is, what you're doing is you're introducing constraints. You're not just allowing things, spontaneous self-organization in human beings is the same as spontaneous combustion, right? What you actually want is to introduce the constraints, because that's when you understand the theory, then you can apply it to practice. And that's why people have got it wrong. They just let people assemble with whoever they want. So they assemble with people who think like them. You actually want people to self-assemble in teams with people they haven't worked with before who think differently, because that increases the scanning density overall. So organizations need to, and sorry about language, they need to be ontologically aware. They need to know this is complex, therefore we'll probe. This is complicated, therefore we'll analyze. This is simple. Why the hell have you bothered me with it? You should already have done it. Yeah? So that's key. Any more? Yeah.
Going back to the Swindon roundabout.
Yeah.
It's a complex problem, right? And it's you sort of said that it's people come up with their own solutions given the constraints. Isn't that what Scrum tries to do?
Yeah. The problem is, and I think I mean, Scrum and Agile I think are really interesting. I think they have huge potential. I really disagree with the people who are deifying the founders of Scrum at the moment. Yeah, no, sorry, let me finish the point, because it's a starting point. What we got with Scrum and Agile is some practices that good people have learned to do because they're good people and applied common sense. What we've now got, this is what we're trying to do with the calm stuff. Now we understand the theory of complexity, and particularly of human complex systems. We need to start to move them together, and Scrum will change. A lot of Scrum methods are actually complicated and not complex. But Scrum people have now started to decide they're complex and everybody else is complicated, and that really is stupid. Yeah? Because actually it destroys the potential for development downstream. The other issue is, and let me make the point I made in Keynote, people haven't realised the need for an apprentice model. So people are going on 2-day Scrum courses, doing a multi-choice questionnaire to become a Scrum Master. I mean, multi-choice questionnaires don't work. They're failing to realise it takes 2 to 3 years to actually build the expertise. So the other thing we're trying to do with the Calm group, which is an open group with several of us, is to say, can we actually create an apprentice model with a training schedule where you have to do some complexity training, some anthropology training, some technical training over a 3 to 4 year period and keep a workbook? Because then we become a profession rather than just a bunch of amateurs going on courses.
What's the name of the program?
We're on Calm Beta now. We did Calm Alpha in Reading, and we made it too open. We discovered, I mean, I should have realised this, all right? Economics departments and computer science departments in universities have the highest degree of partial autism. So throwing people from that background into a completely unstructured environment, which would have worked with executives, didn't work. Yeah? So with Calm Beta, well, it worked. We've got a lot of value out of it. Calm Beta, which is in Boulder, which is on our website now, is actually putting more structure. So we're now going to start to fuse the methods. So my view is Lean should never be coupled with Six Sigma. Because actually, waste in Lean means getting rid of Six Sigma. It's needless bureaucratic control. So putting them together is just an obvious contradiction, right? Lean as a philosophy works really well with complexity. Yeah, Scrum and Agile have got the practical methods, so we now want to build a body of theory and practice, yeah, which will be done collaboratively between many companies, because the other thing I'm fed up in this industry is one person or one small company trying to create a method and trying to control the space. Yeah, and we can't afford that either. You know, the world needs a more open approach. Yes?
Yeah. I was concerning about the world of software startups where the, let's say, chaotic and complex area are quite familiar. If we see the statistics, we have almost 97% of startups failing. Mm-hmm. But I would say when they move from chaotic, I don't know, to complex area, they need some process to structure other processes. In that case, there should be, what do you think, there are other layers where we can say that management is structured in a different area?
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 numbers it's worth bearing in mind, all right? 5, Miller's number. Yeah. Human short-term brain memory is 7 plus or minus 2. So the maximum things you can remember simultaneously is 5. You know, so if you drive around a strange city and you get lost, if you're male, you drive around for 2 hours trying to find your own way. Women have no understanding of our need for exploration, right? But fundamentally, if somebody finally gives you directions, more than 5 you can't remember. 15 is the maximum number of people who can simultaneously trust each other. It's roughly correlated with the average size of an extended family in the society in which you grew up in, because it's an habituated pattern learned when the brain is very plastic. 150 Dunbar's number is the number of acquaintances you can maintain, the people you can know. Yeah? Now actually the organisational form, sub 5, sub 15, sub 150, is very different. And the big problem startups do is they start off less than 15, with all the communication capability that that has, or even less than 5. Then they go above that magic number of 15. We found this in Cognitive Edge. We went to 17 or 18, we had politics and real problems. Whereas under 15 we didn't. And we didn't, even though we knew the theory, we didn't actually change the structure. Because once we were above 15, we needed functionalism. Everybody couldn't know everything anymore. Once you move above 150, you can't know the capabilities of everybody you're working anymore, so the things change. Okay? So starting to realize that different management techniques are required in different spaces. And also, to be quite honest, some people are better at managing different spaces than others. Very few people can manage in all of them. I mean, we used to have an adage. I used to do crisis management in IBM, which is fun. But the old adage is, if you have a good crisis manager, fire them, because they create the crises in the first place. So they can manage out of them. It's like, if you know the highest case of prosecutable arson in the world is firefighters. If you get a deliberately planted fire, the police will assume it's somebody who's a firefighter, because they like fires. Right? It's actually quite a significant correlation. Now, one of the issues here is to realize that good crisis managers are like good startup managers. So people who can start things shouldn't try and build them, because it's a completely different skill set. I've got a friend who's a serial entrepreneur. The minute his company hits 9 people, he sells it, because he only wants to manage within that very small size group. Okay? So it's horses for courses. You know the British phrase?
Yes.
Yeah, horses for courses. Different horses run better on different grounds. Is the whole point about this diversity. It's not that one thing is right or wrong, or one thing is better or worse than the other. Different things work in different contexts. Okay? Yeah, at the back.
Yeah, you mentioned before that without a state is transitional, but you can intentionally go there and innovate. So why then you should go away from the chaotic state?
Because you pop out almost straight away. To go with Axelrod, order comes for free. And if you look in chemical reactions, a complex reaction in a chaotic reaction, patterns will form very quickly and it will become complex. So actually it's very difficult to take things into chaos. Yeah, because actually they'll come out. The secret on it, and this is something we teach, but it's called a shallow dive into chaos. If you go deep into chaos, you've got no idea where you'll come out. I sometimes call it the Masada gambit. All else has failed, we might as well all commit suicide, right? A shallow dive into chaos means you relax the constraints so they almost don't exist, but then you put people proximate to novel or new ideas from a different field. So for example, I'm doing a project in Africa next year where we're looking at AIDS orphans, and what we're doing is we're bringing physicists, anthropologists and biologists. We're not letting anybody from the medical profession or the development community in on the workshop. Because what we want is people with deep knowledge from radically different backgrounds to look at the problem from afresh. But what we're doing there is we're relaxing the constraints completely, but then the new constraints will come in and it will emerge in a different space. That would be an example of a shallow dive. Yeah. Incidentally, by the way, biologists are often better at systems design than engineers. I'm quite serious. We've got biologists working at Bath University at the moment with the engineering department. They're coming up with ideas that the software department wouldn't even have thought of, because they're looking at models that come from nature. This using different knowledge bases is key. Any more? Okay, guys. Sorry I can't be with you tonight. I've got to go on and do another one in Copenhagen tomorrow. Thank you for your time. The slides will go up on our website later, and I think it's been videoed. So if anybody wants the slides, don't panic. I'll put them up tonight. Okay? Cheers.
Together.
Which restaurant? Sorry.
Quickly home.